Beginning. Pandemic Book 1. Written by Christine Kersey. Narrated by Andrew Tell. Chapter 1. Jessica. The first sign that the world was about to come to an end was when Jessica's teenage children informed her that prom had been canceled. Canceled? Jessica asked, as she handed out bag lunches. What on earth for? Too many kids have the flu, Dylan, her 14-year-old, said. Jessica looked at Kayla for confirmation. 16 and about to attend her first prom, Kayla frowned. It sucks. That's because you won't be able to make out with Ethan now. Dylan made kissing noises to emphasize his point. Kayla swatted at him. Stop it. Both of you stop it, Jessica said. You're going to make me late for work. She loved her job as a dental hygienist, but now that she thought about it, a lot of patients had canceled due to illness. Maybe her family should stay home for a day or two. Let whatever bug that was going around pass them by. None of them could afford to get sick. Then she thought about Matt, her husband. He'd gone to work already. He was a software developer, and Jessica knew he'd been stressed with all the work he had on his plate. Maybe she could convince him to work from home, something he did from time to time. Sighing, she set her purse on the counter. Okay, family meeting. Wait, Dylan said. We can't have a family meeting without Dad. I know, but this is different. He's not here, and this seems like kind of an emergency. An emergency that there's no prom? Dylan rolled his eyes. It is an emergency, Kayla said. No, Jessica said, not because of prom, because of this flu. I've heard a few news reports that it's pretty nasty, and it sounds like it's really going around. Maybe, was this really the best idea? Maybe we should all kind of hunker down for a few days until it's... Yes! Dylan said, cutting Jessica off. No school! Woohoo! Kayla looked less certain. What about, missing all the stuff my teachers will be teaching? Dylan laughed. You just don't want to miss seeing Ethan. Kayla huffed out a protest, but Jessica knew what Dylan said was probably true. You can keep in touch with your friends, Jessica said. Just not in person. Kayla's lips compressed. Jessica smiled. Let me call Dad and see what he says. Dylan had already set his lunch bag on the counter and dropped his backpack on the floor. But we're not going to school today, right? Was Matt going to tell her she was being overly dramatic? Maybe, but in her gut, she knew this was the right thing to do. Yes, no school today. Woot, woot, Dylan shouted as he pumped a fist in the air before racing for the stairs. Do you really think we can get sick? Kayla asked, her forehead furrowed. Though Jessica was concerned, she didn't want her kids to worry. Not if we stay away from sick people. Mom, Kayla said as she rolled her eyes. Let me call Dad, okay? Kayla nodded, then she flopped onto the couch with her phone already in her hand. Jessica went upstairs to the master bedroom and closed the door before calling her husband's cell. He answered on the second ring. What's up, honey? I'm just about to head into a meeting. Jessica pictured her husband, 6 feet tall, relatively fit, and still as handsome as the day she'd met him. I was, wondering if you could work from your home office today, and maybe tomorrow. What? His tone showed he thought she was nuts. Why would I do that? Have any of your coworkers called in sick lately? He paused. A few people have, yeah. More than normal? I guess so, yeah. Honey, the kids' school canceled prom because so many kids have that flu that's going around. Just to be safe, I'm keeping them home for a few days. I'm going to stay home too. Really? Shock was evident in his voice. You never miss work. I know. She heard noise in the background. It sounded like Matt had shifted the phone away from his mouth. Hey, he said, I've got to go. I'll call you after my meeting. All right, but think about it. Working from home, I mean. Okay, bye. Next, she called the dentist's office where she worked to let them know she wasn't coming in. Are you sick too? Rochelle, her coworker, asked. Too? Who else is sick? Rochelle named several others who worked there. Hearing the names of so many people she knew who were sick sent a beat of concern through her. No, Jessica said. I'm not sick, just trying to stay that way. Maybe you're on to something there. Jessica thought about her coworker and friend. Rochelle was 16 weeks pregnant with her first baby. If she caught this flu, could it put her baby in jeopardy? Maybe you ought to head home, Rochelle, just in case. Sighing heavily, she said, I can't afford to take any more time off. You know how much time I took off when I was so sick at the beginning of the pregnancy? I used all my sick days. Jessica bit her lip. Just, I don't know. Be safe, okay? Rochelle chuckled. I'm sure I'll be fine. They disconnected, and Jessica set her phone on her bedside table before turning on the news. Concerned about how quickly this flu is spreading, the news reporter was saying. Jessica turned up the volume. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reports that this strain has resulted in higher than average fatalities, and they remind people to take sanitary measures after being around other people. Wash your hands frequently, cover your mouth when you cough or sneeze, and if you or a family member has any symptoms, stay home for at least 72 hours after the symptoms have ended. This looks like a nasty one, folks. The anchor went on to another story, and Jessica shut off the TV, then used her phone to look up more information. She spent a good hour reading articles about the flu, each one making her concern notch up higher than the last. She hoped Rochelle would change her mind and go home. An image of her mom popped into her head. Recently diagnosed with breast cancer, her mom lived out of state, alone. Jessica had already arranged to take time off the following week to fly out for a visit. She hadn't seen her mom in several months and wanted to spend time with her. She and her mom had always been close. Being the only child of a single mother did that sometimes. It was important to her to be able to give her mom the support she needed. Briefly wondering if this flu would affect her plans, Jessica shook her head. Surely by the next week, the whole thing would have blown over. It had to. Mom? Kayla said as she knocked. Come in, sweetie. Kayla opened the door and sat on the bed. What did Dad say? He's in a meeting. He'll call me when he's done. But you told him about the flu? Kayla's eyebrows tugged together. She seemed much more worried than she'd been earlier. What's wrong, honey? Nothing. I mean, She frowned. I looked some stuff up just now about the flu. Yeah, so it sounds like it's not the regular flu. That was the same conclusion Jessica was beginning to reach, but she wasn't about to share her worries. Not yet. Not when there wasn't a whole lot they could do about it. People are working on it. What people? Kayla asked, her eyebrows tugging together. What are they doing to fix it? Jessica struggled to come up with an answer. Her phone rang, saving her from having to make something up. It's Dad, she said, as she looked at her phone. Kayla frowned, then left the room. Chapter 2. Matt. The moment Matt finished his meeting, he went to his cubicle and did some quick online research into the flu that Jessica had called him about. When she'd asked him if he would work from home, his first instinct had been to brush her off. He had a lot of work to do, and he much preferred working in the office where he could chat with other developers. 3 things made him reconsider. First, Jessica wasn't one to overreact, so the fact that she was staying home from work gave him pause, especially since she was planning on taking time off to visit her mom the next week. Second, in the meeting he'd just gotten out of, half of the people who should have been there had called in sick. And finally, Despite the fact that the media outlets were making a huge deal about this flu, he got the sense that maybe, for a change, they might not be exaggerating. Decision made, he picked up his phone and called Jessica, his mind in task mode as he mentally listed all of the things they should do to prepare for the possibility that they would need to hunker down at home for an unspecified period of time. "Hello," Jessica said a moment later. "Hi, babe." Without greeting him, she said, "The news is saying this flu is pretty nasty. Some people have even died, more than is typical for a flu." "I know. Are you going to come home?" He could hear the worry in her voice. "Yes." "You are?" Now hopeful disbelief. Matt scrolled through the long list of software bugs he was assigned to fix and tried not to feel overwhelmed. His family's safety had to come first. "Don't sound so surprised." "Okay," Jessica said with a laugh. "When are you leaving?" Matt turned away from his computer screen and glanced toward his boss's office. "In a few minutes. I need to clear it with Dan first." "At least traffic shouldn't be too heavy." One side of his mouth quirked up. "True." He paused a beat. "I'm thinking of stopping by Costco on the way home to stock up on a few things and fuel up my truck." "Is that a good idea? I mean, what if sick people are there? Besides, we have that freeze-dried stuff we bought a few years ago." Several years earlier, Matt had gotten interested in emergency preparedness, so he and Jessica had splurged on a 6-month supply of freeze-dried meals for their family of 4. It still had more than 20 years of shelf life left, and it had been expensive. He really didn't want to use it if they didn't need to. "I'd rather not dip into that," he said. "Not when I can go to the store and buy what we need." Jessica was silent. "Okay, just please be careful." Matt laughed. "Oh, I will be." They discussed what he should buy, and after he disconnected, he talked to his boss and got clearance to work from home for a while. The drive from his job in Salt Lake City to the suburb where he lived in the southern part of Salt Lake County usually took 30 to 40 minutes. Of course, that was during commute time in the late afternoons. Right now, it was mid-morning, so traffic was relatively light. Was that because of the time of day, or because so many people had stayed home from work? Shaking his head at the idea that enough people were sick that traffic would be affected, Matt took the exit that would take him to Costco. First, he went to their gas station, and after filling the regular tank on his truck with diesel fuel, he folded back a corner of the material that covered the bed of his truck before opening the cap on his auxiliary tank. He and his family had a 33-foot fifth-wheel RV, and when they'd looked for a truck to pull it with, they'd found one that already had a 40-gallon auxiliary tank installed. Matt loved the convenience of carrying over 60 gallons of fuel when pulling the RV. It really cut down on the need to pull the RV into gas stations not equipped to handle such a large rig. The only drawback was the cost. Dropping a couple $100 on one fill-up was hard, but right now, filling the auxiliary tank seemed like the prudent thing to do. Once he'd finished filling both tanks, he parked his truck in the main parking lot. He was surprised at how busy Costco was at this time of day. Maybe it was always this busy. He'd never been there in the morning in the middle of the week. Besides, was Costco ever not busy? Wanting a flatbed cart to haul his purchases, he looked around but didn't see any near the entrance. He had to walk back out to the parking lot to find one, and once he did, he went inside and started shopping. Right away, he noticed something unusual. Where the shelves typically had plenty of every item, now the supplies seemed to be depleted, and there were a lot of people with entire cases of canned goods in their shopping carts or on flatbed carts. More people getting cases of food than he'd ever seen before. It looked like everyone had the same idea he did. Ignoring the spark of alarm that lit inside his chest, he focused on loading whatever cases he could get onto his cart, as well as batteries and toilet paper. On one aisle, a woman began coughing. Everyone backed away from her, including Matt. He not only backed away, he went to a different aisle entirely. Once he'd stacked all that would fit onto his cart, he made his way to the register. Long lines had formed, more like the lines he saw just before Christmas, and it was April. Squashing the trepidation that kept pushing to the surface, he worked to stay patient until it was his turn to check out. Once he reached his truck, he began unloading everything into the back seat. "Hey," a man said to him. Matt turned to see what the guy wanted. "I'll take that cart off your hands when you're done." Matt had other plans. "Thanks, but I have a few more things to get, so I'll need to hang on to it." The man scowled, but walked away without incident. Matt managed to fit everything inside the cab of the truck, and after locking the doors, he went back inside the store. To his surprise, it looked like the crowd had nearly doubled, and more than one person appeared to be sick. Hurrying forward anyway, Matt avoided anyone who looked the slightest bit sick and loaded his cart with more canned goods and water. Then he went to the area where vitamins and other health items were stocked. That section seemed less busy, so he had no trouble getting what he wanted before adding boxes of protein shakes, protein bars, and 2 large first aid kits. Then he noticed a shelf with 3 boxes of face masks. He set all of the boxes onto his stack of goods. "You can't take all of those!" a woman shouted as she ran up to him. He glanced at the pricing label above the shelf, then turned to the woman. "Doesn't say there's a purchase limit." She narrowed her eyes. "Don't you think someone else might want some?" Matt stared at the woman, then decided it wasn't worth it to make a scene. He took one of the boxes off his cart and handed it to her. She snatched it from his hand. "I need one more." Laughing at the nerve of the woman, Matt shook his head and walked away. "Hey!" she yelled. Several people looked in their direction, but Matt ignored them and went to another aisle, where he tucked the 2 boxes of face masks underneath other items on his cart so that they were no longer visible. Then he headed to the longer-than-ever lines at the register. He made it to his truck without further incident, loading all of the items from this trip into the bed of his truck. Glad he had a cover over the bed of his truck to hide his purchases from prying eyes, he climbed behind the wheel. Hoping he hadn't forgotten anything, he left the parking lot and pointed his truck toward home. On the way, he passed a sporting goods store and decided to stock up on ammo for his .45 caliber pistol. While at the gun counter, he saw a 9mm that he thought was pretty sweet. Normally, he wouldn't spend that kind of money without talking to Jessica, but he decided to buy it along with a rifle. He could always return them if Jessica objected. Since he had his concealed carry permit, a background check wasn't necessary, and he was able to walk out of the store with his newly purchased weapons. On the drive home, Matt pictured the look on Jessica's face when he showed her all he'd bought. Was she going to laugh at him, think he was crazy, or be grateful? Trying not to worry about that, most of what he'd bought they would eventually use anyway, he continued on his way. Chapter 3. Jessica. What was taking Matt so long? It had been hours since he'd left his office. He should have already gotten home, even with stopping at Costco. Jessica tried not to worry, but her active imagination had Matt in a life-threatening car accident or some other awful situation. "Mom," Dylan said, "I'm hungry." Trying to push down her worries, Jessica told Dylan he could have an apple. Moments later, she heard the deadbolt unlocking on the front door. Exhaling in relief, she hurried to greet Matt, sliding her arms around his waist. "How'd it go?" she asked as she pulled away. With a wry look, he tilted his head. "It was crazy there." "Really? Crazier than normal?" "I've never seen it this bad, not even right before Christmas." That concerned Jessica, because if that many people were as worried about this flu as she was, it had to be serious. "Were you able to get what you wanted?" "Yeah. Good. They walked toward the kitchen. By the way, make sure to wash your hands thoroughly. Matt grimaced. Good reminder. I think some of the people there were sick. Startled, Jessica didn't say anything. No reason to get worked up over things they had no control over. Hey, Dad, Dylan said around a bite of apple. Hey, sport. Matt turned on the water, then glanced at Jessica. Can you move your car out of the garage? I want to back my truck in for us to unload. Jessica's eyebrows tugged together. Matt never put his truck in the garage, mostly because it was too long. You won't fit. He scrubbed his hands with soap. I'll back in as far as I can. I don't necessarily want the neighbors to see all of the stuff I bought. What did you buy? Dylan asked, his eyes wide. Matt finished washing, then dried his hands on a towel. Nothing exciting, just lots of food, and I'll need your help to bring it in. Dylan nodded. Okay. Jessica parked her car at the curb in front of the house and watched as Matt backed his truck into the garage. Canned goods were stacked in the cab of the truck, and when he opened the gate on the back to reveal the rest of his purchases, she turned to him in shock. How much did you spend? He looked a little sheepish. I'm not sure you want to know, but I mostly bought stuff we'd use anyway. He grinned. Now we won't have to go to the store for a while. Jessica shook her head. Yeah, like 3 or 4 years. Dylan lifted a case of canned chili from the truck. Where do you want me to put it? Matt turned to him with a smile. Let's put everything in the basement storage room. And get your sister to help. That brought a grin to Dylan's face. Okay. Ask nicely, Jessica called after him. Then she faced Matt. Do you really think you needed to buy so much? Matt lifted his shoulders in a shrug. Who knows? But when I saw the purchasing frenzy and the shelves emptying out, I kind of panicked. Emptying out? The shelves at Costco were never empty, except for that one Christmas when a particular toy had been all the rage, but never food items. Yeah, a lady even yelled at me for taking the last boxes of face masks. Jessica had trouble picturing a random stranger behaving that way. The people in their community were generally friendly, especially when they were face-to-face with someone. Whoa, Kayla said with a smirk as she stepped into the garage and looked at the contents of the truck. That's a lot of stuff, Dad. Face sobering, she looked at Matt. Do you really think the flu is that serious? Jessica smiled. I think your dad went a little overboard. Kayla's face smoothed out. Yeah, and now we have to carry it all the way to the basement. Yes, you do, Matt said. So get busy. Kayla rolled her eyes before hefting a case of canned green beans into her arms and heading into the house. I'm sorry, Matt said. I didn't mean to go so crazy at the store, he chuckled. You should know better than to send me alone. Touching his arm, Jessica smiled. No, I think what you bought is fine. I said that to Kayla because I don't want her or Dylan to worry. This flu scare will probably pass like previous flu scares, and we'll all be just fine. I hope so. With that, they helped the kids carry the food down to the basement, although Jessica noticed Matt carrying several boxes of ammo into their bedroom. Curious what that was all about, she followed him. I didn't know they sold ammo at Costco, she said with a smirk. He smiled as he put the boxes on a high shelf in their closet. I stopped at a sporting goods store afterwards and decided to stock up. She shook her head. Are you done with your shopping spree now? He laughed. Yeah, I think we're good. His eyebrows rose. Unless you want to risk going out. No, that's what online shopping is for. His face got serious. That's actually not a bad idea. What do you mean? We ought to see if there's anything else we should have on hand. You know, in case of an emergency. Jessica agreed, and once the truck had been completely unloaded and moved back into the driveway, she and Matt sat in front of the computer and pulled up Amazon. They ordered a number of items to add to their emergency stores, including a solar hand-crank radio flashlight, 4 portable water purifier straws, and 4 bug-out bags, each one providing 72 hours of supplies. "In 2 days, we'll be ready for the end of the world," Matt said with a grin. Jessica forced a smile, hoping that in 2 days, they would be laughing at themselves. Chapter 4. Jessica. "Mom!" Kayla said the next afternoon as she raced into the living room, her tone nearing hysteria. Jessica set down the book she'd been reading and leapt to her feet. "What's wrong?" "Brooke's mom," Kayla said, as tears filled her eyes. Jessica pictured Kayla's best friend, Brooke. Tall and slender, with long auburn hair, she was a fixture around their house. Jessica didn't know Brooke's mom well, but she'd always been friendly. "What happened?" "She died." Kayla's face crumpled as tears streamed down her face. "Brooke's mom died." Jessica drew Kayla into her arms as shockwaves cascaded over her. "What?" She slowly pulled away from Kayla, her mind racing. "When? How? Today? Oh my goodness. What happened?" "She was fine last night, but she woke up feeling sick." Kayla's voice shook as she spoke. "Brooke's dad took her mom to the hospital, but she died, Mom. She's dead." Tears rolled down Kayla's cheeks. Astonished and rather alarmed, Jessica needed to know more. "What did she have? Do they know?" Kayla stared at Jessica as stark panic washed over her face. "The flu. It was the flu." Jessica's mouth fell open. It was shocking that someone could be fine one day and dead the next from a virus. "Mom, what if Brooke gets the flu? I mean, she was exposed to it, right?" Fresh tears filled Kayla's eyes. "What if Brooke dies too?" Jessica didn't want to point out that any of them could catch the deadly flu, and she had no words of reassurance to give Kayla. "What's going on?" Matt asked as he came into the room. He'd risen early and had worked from his home office all day. After hearing about Brooke's mother, Jessica was doubly glad Matt had agreed to work from home. "Brooke's mom passed away." Jessica's voice was surprisingly calm. "From the flu." Matt's eyebrows shot up. Then he went to Kayla and wrapped her in a hug. She lay her head against his shoulder and sobbed. As he comforted her, his gaze met Jessica's. Jessica read the worry in his eyes as clearly as if he'd said the words out loud. "I feel like I should do something," Kayla said, as she stepped away from Matt, her face streaked with tears. "What would you like to do?" Jessica asked. "I don't know. Bring her and her dad something to eat?" Jessica's gaze slid to Matt, who subtly shook his head. Then Jessica looked at Kayla. "That's very sweet of you, but under the circumstances, I don't think it would be a good idea to go over there." Deep creases formed on Kayla's forehead. "Right, of course." Relieved that Kayla understood, Jessica gave her another hug and murmured, "I love you, sweetheart." "I love you too," Kayla whispered. Then she turned and headed toward her room. Later that evening, the 4 of them gathered in the family room to watch the local news. Jessica sat on the couch beside Matt, and Dylan sprawled on the floor. Kayla, however, sat on the edge of the recliner, her back ramrod straight, as the 4 of them waited for the broadcast to begin. Moments later, it did. The first announcement was that the schools in multiple school districts in the state, including theirs, would be closed until further notice. It had been decided that since so many kids were sick, it would be best to keep everyone home. "No school?" Dylan said, his eyebrows rising as he looked at Jessica and Matt. "Whoa. Guess you guys won't be missing anything by being home," Matt said with a sardonic grin. "This is crazy," Kayla said, her gaze glued to the TV. "Crazy awesome," Dylan said with an ear-to-ear smile. I know it seems great, Jessica said, but remember what's behind it. People are getting sick. She glanced at Kayla. Sick enough to die. Dylan's smile vanished. Yeah, I know. During the broadcast, Jessica kept thinking about Rochelle. After they'd spoken the day before, had she decided to stay home today? When the news was over, Jessica went into her bedroom and called her. Hello? A gravelly voice said. Had Jessica gotten the wrong number? The voice that answered sounded much deeper than Rochelle's. Maybe it was her husband. Is Rochelle there? It's me, Jess. Unease rattled through her. Are you sick? I should have listened to you yesterday. I should have gone home. I feel like death warmed over. Oh no. Have you been to the doctor? I have an appointment in the morning. That was something, at least. I'm so sorry you're sick. You and me both. They didn't talk long, and after they hung up, Jessica called her mom. Hi, sweetie, her mom said, her voice cheerful. How are you? Half expecting to learn that her mom had caught the flu. After all, with the cancer treatment, her immune system had been weakened. When her mom sounded like her normal, happy self, Jessica quietly exhaled in relief. I'm good. I wanted to see how you're doing. Same old, same old. I spent most of the day working on my new quilt. It's coming along beautifully, Jessica. I can hardly wait to show it to you when you're here next week. Thrilled her mom was doing as well as possible, Jessica sat back and enjoyed their chat, still hopeful that she would be able to make the trip. That night, after Jessica and Matt got in bed, they turned on the news. As expected, the main topic of discussion was the flu that was sweeping the country and even the world. They listened in quiet horror as the anchor calmly announced that the fatality rate was climbing and that it was becoming common to catch the flu and die in a single day. That's what happened to Brooke's mom, Jessica said, barely above a whisper, as if saying it any louder would bring the same fate to their house. Could the same thing happen to Rochelle? Appalled by the thought, she decided she would call her first thing in the morning to check on her. Matt leaned over and kissed her on the lips. I'm glad you convinced me to work from home. Pushing aside her worries, she put her arms around him and lay her head on his chest as a feeling of safety washed over her. I'm glad you agreed. They listened as the news anchor talked to a representative from the CDC. Turn that up, Jessica said as she straightened. Matt complied, and Jessica breathed a sigh of relief when the woman from the CDC said that it appeared that the incubation period from being exposed to the virus to when symptoms appeared was 24 hours. It's been longer than that since any of us have been around other people, Jessica said. She turned to look at Matt. Does that mean we're safe? He grimaced. I hope so. Chapter 5. Matt. Rochelle's not answering her phone, Jessica said to Matt the next morning. Working in his office, he turned to her with confusion. Who? Rochelle? From work? He still didn't know what she was talking about. Okay. She dragged her hands through her hair. When I called her last night, she was sick. She was going to the doctor this morning, but she's not answering her phone. Knowing Brooke's mother had died from the flu, Matt understood why Jessica was worried. Still, he didn't want her to jump to conclusions. Maybe she was in with the doctor when you called. Jessica's face relaxed a little. Maybe. She pulled her phone out of her pocket. I'll text her and ask her to call me. She gave him a quick kiss. Sorry to bother you. He smiled. You never bother me. She returned his smile. I'll let you get back to work. Later that morning, the doorbell rang. Ready for a break, Matt got to the door in time to see the UPS driver walking away from the packages he'd left on the porch. Watching the man through the side lights beside the front door, when the driver lifted his hand to his mouth and had a coughing fit, Matt recoiled. He couldn't bring the packages inside. The virus could be all over them. "Are those our packages from Amazon?" Jessica asked. The kids were right behind her. "Who is that?" Dylan asked. Frowning, Matt turned to them. "Yes, it's our packages, but I think the delivery guy was sick. He was coughing up a lung." "You can't bring them in," Kayla said, her eyebrows bunched. "I mean, what if the delivery guy has the virus? Could we get it?" Concern filled her eyes. "I don't want to get sick." Matt stepped away from the still-closed front door and went to Kayla before pulling her into a hug. He knew she was thinking of Brooke and her family. Besides, he agreed. "We'll do everything we can to stay healthy." He stepped back. "Any ideas?" He glanced at Dylan to include him in the question. Dylan, who usually made fun of his sister at every opportunity, was uncharacteristically helpful. "What if we leave them on the porch for a few hours? Won't the virus die?" Kayla didn't look convinced, but Matt smiled. "That's actually a good idea, Dylan." Dylan grinned under the compliment. "How long does it take for the virus to die?" Kayla asked, her eyes tight with worry. "I'm not sure," Matt said. "Let me look it up." He pulled his phone out of his pocket and Googled the question. Moments later, he frowned as he looked at Kayla. "This virus can live on hard surfaces for up to 24 hours. Jessica looked thoughtful. "What if we spray some disinfectant on the boxes?" "Do you really think that would kill the virus?" Dylan asked. Looking grim, Jessica shrugged. "I don't know. Or we can wait until tomorrow to bring them in." "And risk someone stealing them off our porch?" Matt shook his head. They had important supplies in those boxes. He wasn't about to risk someone taking them. The way things were going, he was becoming more convinced by the minute that all the things he'd bought 2 days earlier, plus the items on their porch, would become vital, especially as the news reported increasing fatality rates. Jessica sighed, clearly stressed by all that was happening. "What do you want to do?" That's when Matt got an idea. "Wait here. I'll be right back." He went out to their RV, which was stored in the side yard, took a small box out of the storage area, and came back into the house. He held up the box of disposable gloves that he used when emptying the RV's waste tanks. "Problem solved." "What are you going to do?" Dylan asked, his face bright with interest. Matt put on a pair of the blue disposable gloves and a face mask. Then he went to the laundry room where the cleaning supplies were stored. He took out a spray bottle of disinfectant and carried it back to where his family waited. "I got this," he said with a grin. He went into the garage and pressed the opener. Once the garage had rumbled open, he went to the front porch, sprayed a generous mist of disinfectant over the boxes that sat on the porch, then carried them one by one, careful to hold the boxes away from his body, into the garage. When he was done, he tossed the gloves in the trash, closed the garage, and went inside where he washed his hands with soapy water before putting the face mask aside and turning to his family with a triumphant smile. "We'll leave them in the garage for at least 24 hours. "Dad," Dylan said with an ear-splitting grin, "you're a genius." "That was pretty smart," Kayla said. Jessica wrapped her arms around him. "I knew I married you for more than your good looks." Enjoying the accolades from his family, he laughed. Chapter 6. Jessica. Jessica hadn't heard back from Rochelle. She'd made several other attempts throughout the day to call her, but each time the call had gone straight to voicemail. Concerned, but not knowing what to do, she hoped Rochelle would finally get in touch with her and tell her she was okay. That evening, as Jessica was making dinner, Kayla came into the kitchen. "Mom?" "Hi, honey." She put the casserole in the oven and set the timer for 30 minutes. "Mom, I don't know what to do." She turned to face her. "About what?" Kayla sighed. "Brooke keeps asking me if I can come over." "No." The words left Jessica's mouth without thought. Eyes widening at Jessica's tone, Kayla said, I know I can't go over there, but what should I tell her? I mean, her mom died and now her dad's sick. Thoughts of Rochelle, sick the night before, filled her mind. Oh no. Her expression must have broadcast her worry because tears filled Kayla's eyes. He's going to die, isn't he? Jessica rushed to Kayla and put her arms around her. Not necessarily, sweetheart. Not everyone who gets sick dies. She desperately hoped that was right. Kayla stepped back, her eyes wet and her eyebrows tugging together. Yes, they do. I read it online. Had the fatality rate climbed higher? Where did you read that? Kayla took her phone out of her pocket, tapped something into the screen, then showed it to Jessica, who read the headline. Fatality rate skyrockets to 95%. Terror slammed through her. Pressing a hand to her chest, she found it hard to catch her breath. She had to talk to Matt, had to discuss what to do. But first, she needed to comfort Kayla. She put an arm around Kayla's shoulder as they both stared at the ominous words. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Everyone's going to die, aren't they? Even us. Jessica met Kayla's gaze. No. That's why we've quarantined ourselves. To stay healthy. To stay alive. Kayla's forehead creased like she didn't quite believe her. I'm gonna call Brooke. Jessica loved Kayla's compassion. Good idea. She needs all the support you can give her. The moment Kayla cleared the room, Jessica hustled into Matt's office. It looked like he was deep into coding, and though she didn't want to interrupt him when he was in the flow, this couldn't wait. I have some news. He spun his chair to face her, his expression guarded. Bad news? Jessica frowned. That's all we seem to have lately. What is it? Brooke's dad is sick now. Matt's forehead furrowed. Oh no. Yeah, evidently the fatality rate is now 95%. His eyebrows shot up. What? She gave him the web address for the site Kayla had shown her, and they looked it up together. With a more thorough read, the news was even worse than Jessica had at first realized. Not only had the fatality rate skyrocketed, but the virus was spreading extremely fast. Matt turned to her, his expression sober. You realize what this means, don't you? A million thoughts flew through Jessica's mind, but she didn't want to give voice to a single one of them. Still, she had to know what Matt was thinking. What? This thing could lead to collapse. She knew what he was saying, but she didn't want to accept it. What kind of collapse? What do you mean? His face was grim. Total societal collapse. From the flu? No. She shook her head in denial. No, that can't happen, Matt. Why are you saying that? Think about it, Jess. He held up his hand and touched a finger. If enough people die, who's going to deliver food to the stores? He touched a second finger and then a third. Who's going to run the water treatment facilities? The sewage treatment facilities? He touched a fourth. Who's going to keep the electrical grid going? Panic, powerful and swift, crashed over her. How could a little flu bug lead to all of that? But not everyone is getting sick. Matt gazed at her. Do you think anyone who's healthy is going to want to go to work? He gestured to the programming code on his computer screen to emphasize his point. I'm not. Can't they work from home too? He tilted his head like he didn't want to point out the obvious because it was such a horrible truth, but he had no choice. There are only so many people who know how to run the utility companies, and it's unlikely all of them will survive this. And those who do probably have to be at the facility to do their job. He frowned. Then there are the truck drivers who deliver food to the stores. Do you think those who survive will want to be out among the sick? And you know stores only have a few days' worth of food in stock. Matt shook his head, his lips lifting in a grim smile. Good thing we stocked up when we did. If there's so much as a single bottle of ketchup on the shelves at this point, I'd be shocked. As it dawned on Jessica how this had the potential to turn into an absolute nightmare, she felt her face pale. How bad do you think it's going to get? Her voice was soft, like if she didn't say it very loud, it might not happen. Matt grimaced. We haven't even discussed law enforcement. What do you mean? Those officers have families of their own. Don't you think they'll want to protect them from all the chaos? Sure, there might be a few out there trying to uphold the law, but how long do you think that will last? You're really scaring me, Matt. He placed his hand on her knee. We need to be prepared for the worst. He gazed at her. That includes the kids. Jessica thought about her kids and how their lives were about to change. If they survived the flu, that is. The thought horrified her. The timer went off in the kitchen. Glad for an excuse to end this disturbing conversation, she stood. Dinner's ready. Chapter 7. Matt. Matt followed Jessica into the kitchen, his mind on all the horrible things he'd told her. He deeply hoped society would make it through, but he feared a collapse was inevitable. Mom, Dad, Dylan said from the family room. Come see this. His tone was laced with unease. What is it? Matt asked, walking into the family room and standing behind the couch where Dylan was sitting. Dylan pointed to the TV and turned up the volume. Matt's eyes went to the flat screen mounted on the wall. It was breaking news. The anchor, a woman who was on every night, was calmly sharing the latest information on the flu with a video showing people, some of them wearing ear-loop masks, fighting over nearly empty shelves at grocery stores. The video changed from one location to another, covering cities in multiple states, but the story was the same over and over. Hospitals are full, the anchor stated, so if you have symptoms, the best place for you and your loved ones is at home. They don't want people to spread it, Dylan said. Then he looked at Matt. Right? Matt set a hand on Dylan's shoulder. Yeah, I think you're right. If anyone in your home has died, authorities ask that you mark your house by painting a red X on your front door or putting a red sheet of paper in your front window. They also ask that you wrap any dead bodies in a sheet until the authorities can collect them. Repelled at the idea, Matt stared at the TV. Dinner's ready, Jessica called from the nearby kitchen. Matt turned and looked at her. Anxiety was etched on her face. It's ready, she said again, as if feeding their family was the only thing she could handle just then. Go get your sister, Matt told Dylan. Once Dylan had left the room, Matt turned off the TV and went into the kitchen. You saw the news? Jessica nodded, but kept her gaze focused on the salad she was tossing. Uh-huh. A few minutes later, the four of them sat around the dining room table, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Brooke said her dad? Kayla's voice broke. She said he looks like her mom did right before she died. Tears overflowed Kayla's lashes. She's going to be an orphan. Kayla glanced at Dylan. She doesn't even have any brothers or sisters. It's just her. Jessica leapt to her feet and raced to Kayla's side, wrapping her arms around her. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Matt watched helplessly as Kayla sobbed and Jessica comforted her. After a moment, he went to them and put his arms around them both. After several minutes, Kayla calmed and they went back to their seats, but no one seemed to be hungry. Even Dylan, who usually ate whatever was placed in front of him. Matt didn't want to add to everyone's distress, but he needed to have a serious talk with his family. Family meeting after dinner. His tone was grim. Everyone looked at him with furrowed brows. Compressing his lips, he met all of their gazes. I know you might not be all that hungry right now, but We need to eat while we can. Matt, Jessica started, but he shook his head. He wasn't ready to discuss this until after dinner. A soft sigh slipped from Jessica's lips, but he ignored it and focused on finishing every bite on his plate. After the dinner dishes were cleaned up, the family gathered in the family room, their faces anxious. Jessica sat next to Matt on the love seat. Kayla and Dylan sat on the couch. Matt looked at the faces of his children. Kayla was barely old enough to drive, and Dylan was just starting to get zits. Still so young, but it was his responsibility to make sure they were as prepared as possible. As you've seen for yourselves, things have changed drastically. Tears filled Kayla's eyes, but Matt could tell she was doing her best to keep her emotions in check. We've done a few things to prepare, he said, but there are things you need to know. He turned to Jessica, whose eyebrows had tugged together. He knew she had to be thinking about their conversation before dinner. Would it be too much to share his fears with his children? Maybe so. He could give them hints without going into too much detail, though. Enough to prepare them without scaring them to death. What? Dylan asked. Matt turned his attention back to the kids. If things don't change, if people keep, he looked at Kayla, dying, well, things are going to get rough. I already know, Dylan said. Matt narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? I've seen The Walking Dead, Dad. I know what can happen. This isn't like that. Dylan snorted a laugh. Right. No zombies. It's not funny, Kayla said, as she gave her brother a shove. He turned to her, his face somber and his voice gentle. I know. Kayla's lips lifted in a tiny smile, like she knew her brother hadn't meant any harm. Deciding to let the kids steer the conversation, Matt asked, What do you think is going to happen, Dylan? Dylan glanced at Kayla, then he faced Matt and Jessica. A lot of people are going to die? He bit his lip. Maybe even us. We're doing everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen, Matt assured him. I know, he said, but it's possible. Matt couldn't argue with that. Still, he wanted to reassure him. As you know, we've self-quarantined, and we'll do our best to stay safe until this flu has run its course. Will it? Kayla asked. Run its course, I mean? This wasn't something Matt could be sure of, but he drew on past history. There have been pandemics before, and they always come to an end. Eventually. But how long will it take? Kayla persisted. Matt turned to Jessica as if she would have an answer. She looked back at him, then she pulled out her phone. Let's look it up, she said, her voice businesslike. She read her screen, then looked at him and the kids. Past pandemics have taken a few weeks to several months to run their course. Are you saying we have to stay locked in our house for months? Kayla asked, her face incredulous. Let's hope not, Matt said. Glad that was her main concern. That's not the biggest problem, Dylan said. And here we go. Kayla turned to her brother. Okay, what's the biggest problem? Because I don't think I can stand staring at your face for months. Dylan's eyebrows shot up like he was offended. Then he shook his head like his sister was an idiot. You'll be lucky if that's your biggest problem. He smiled and ran his fingers through his hair. Besides, I'm one handsome guy. Kayla snorted and turned away. Yeah, right. Dylan looked slightly hurt. I am. Yes, you are, Jessica said. Dylan grinned. Glad his kids still had a sense of humor, Matt smiled. Back to the subject at hand. He looked at the kids. Tell me what you think we're in for. Worst case scenario, Dylan said. No food, no water, no power, no cops. That about covers it. Kayla's gaze shot to Matt, her eyes wide. Is that true? We don't know if that's what will happen, Jessica said, before Matt had a chance to respond. But what if it does? Kayla's forehead was creased, like she had no doubt that's exactly what would happen. That's why we're having this meeting, Matt said, with a glance at Jessica, who stared at him like she hoped he wouldn't go there. He turned to Kayla and Dylan. That's why I wanted you to eat your dinner whether you were hungry at that moment or not. We have a good supply of food and we have a decent supply of water, but I think it would be a good idea to fill all of our pitchers with water as well. Plus, I'll fill the RV's fresh water tank. Kayla's phone chimed a text. She glanced at the screen, then her eyes went wide and she cried, "No!" "What's wrong?" Matt asked. Kayla looked at him, her face filled with shock. "Brooke's dad died." Chapter 8. Jessica. Jessica had feared that Brooke's father wouldn't make it, that it was inevitable he would die, but she'd held out hope nonetheless. Now that hope was gone. She stood from the love seat and went to Kayla, wrapping her arms around her as Kayla sobbed. "Brooke's an orphan," Kayla moaned. "An actual orphan? Her mom and dad are dead. We're all gonna die." The hysteria in her voice rose with each sentence, and all Jessica could do was hold her and murmur that everything would be all right. "No, it won't," Kayla said as she pushed Jessica away. "Nothing will ever be all right. Not anymore." Kayla was completely right. Jessica didn't see any point in arguing against what they all knew to be true. All she could do was stay by Kayla's side with her arm around her shoulder. "I don't want to talk anymore," Kayla whispered. "I think we've done enough talking for one night," Matt said, much to Jessica's relief. They put on a favorite movie, a comedy from years past, but there was very little laughter as the four of them stared at the TV. The movie seemed so pointless. People were dying. How could they sit there watching such an inane show? Holding back a sigh, Jessica excused herself and went into her bedroom and called her mother. "Hi, honey," her mom said, her voice sounding less cheerful than it had when she'd spoken to her last. In fact, it sounded like it was well on the way to how Rochelle's voice had sounded. "How are you?" "Not good, baby." Tense with worry, Jessica asked, "What's wrong?" "I don't know. Earlier today, I started to feel unwell. Scratchy throat, aches and pains, that kind of thing." Dread spiked within her. "Do you have a fever?" "I don't think so. I mean, I've been so chilled." Jessica thought of both of Brooke's parents dying, of Rochelle being sick, and now not answering her phone, of the fatality rate skyrocketing to 95%. Tears flooded her eyes, and a sob leapt up her throat. "It's okay, baby," her mom said. "I'm sure I'll be just fine." Had her mom not seen the news, or was she trying to placate her? Either way, the thought of losing her mom tore her apart. "Jessica, are you there?" "Yes," she croaked out. "Oh, sweetheart, don't cry. I'll see you in a few days, and we'll have a great time." Jessica didn't have the heart to tell her mom that there was no way she would get on an airplane, trapped in a metal tube with recirculated air and potentially sick people. Besides, she knew the chance that her mother would survive was extremely low, especially with how weak the cancer had made her. "I love you, Mom." "I know, sweet girl. I love you too. I always have." Her mom sniffled. "You're my heart." Her mom knew she was going to die. A fresh sob welled up inside Jessica. She needed to get herself under control, needed to take this time to talk to her mom. Breathing deeply, she gathered her emotions. "Tell me about that quilt you've been working on, the one you sent me a picture of." The one with the flowers? Jessica nodded, overcome with emotion once again. Yes, she whispered. Oh, it's coming along beautifully. Jessica listened as her mother spoke, soaking up every word, every syllable, listening to her mom talk until she said, You know, honey, I'm feeling really tired. I'm going to bed now. Let's talk in the morning. Knowing full well that by morning her mom would most likely be dead, for a moment Jessica couldn't catch her breath. It felt as if a band had wrapped around her chest and was compressing. Good night, my love, her mom said, sounding exhausted. Rallying, Jessica said, Good night, Mom. I love you. I love you too. Sleep well. With that, all was silent. Her mom had disconnected the call. That was when Jessica let the sobs overtake her, bathing her face in tears. Chapter 9. Jessica. After lying awake most of the night, Jessica got up before the sun, tiptoed out of her bedroom, went into the family room, and dialed her mother. The phone rang and rang. It was no more than she'd expected, although she'd held on to the hope that her mother would answer. She left a message, asking her mom to call her the moment she woke, then climbed back into bed. No answer? Matt asked. She'd told him and the kids about her mom the night before, in an attempt to prepare them for the worst. Silently, she shook her head. He wrapped her in his arms. I'm so sorry. Savoring the warmth of his body curled around hers, she turned her thoughts to him and their children. A burst of gratitude that they were healthy swept over her, and she knew, somehow, that her mom was at peace. The next afternoon, as Jessica was in the basement storage room organizing all the food Matt had bought, Dylan came bursting into the room. Mom, he said, his voice breathless. Knowing it would be bad news, Jessica dreaded asking, but did anyway. What is it, honey? No airplanes are allowed to fly. She tilted her head in question. What are you talking about? They said so on the news, just now. She followed Dylan up the stairs and into the family room, where the news was broadcasting. A camera was panning a huge airport where airplanes were parked everywhere. Still no word on when planes will be back in the air, the news anchor said. But unnamed sources say all planes will be grounded indefinitely due to the spread of what is now being called the bird flu. What do airplanes have to do with the flu? Dylan asked. Well, if someone is sick and gets on the plane, they can pass the flu on to the other passengers, who can then pass it on to everyone they come into contact with. Before you know it, it's spread all over the world. Don't you think it's already spread all over the world? I mean, it's been going on for a week, and people have been flying all over the world the whole time. Dylan was right, and Jessica knew it. Grounding the planes might help slow the spread, but stopping it now was impossible. I don't know, she said, not wanting to alarm Dylan unnecessarily. The news anchor turned to her guest, a man from the World Health Organization, who basically said the same thing that Dylan had. See? Dylan said with a proud smile. Yup, she ruffled his hair. You're one smart kid. Dylan's eyebrows rose. I'm not a kid anymore, Mom. Jessica was beginning to realize that, because with the way the world was crashing all around them, he and Kayla were going to have to grow up fast. I know, sweetheart, she said. Then she went to Matt's office to tell him what she'd just learned. His door was closed, and she could hear talking. Not wanting to interrupt if he was in a conference call, she slowly twisted the doorknob and opened the door a crack. But when she saw that he was watching the news on his monitor, she walked in and closed the door behind her. He turned at her approach. I just heard about the planes. Might be a little too late to stop this thing. She frowned as she pulled a chair up to Matt's desk so they could watch the broadcast together. I've been doing inventory on all the food and supplies in the storage room. Matt turned the volume down and faced her. And how are we looking? For a change, she had good news. Pretty good, she grinned. You did awesome with your shopping. One side of his mouth quirked up. That's a first. She leaned forward and kissed him on the mouth. I love you. I love you too. Then he gazed at her. We're going to get through this. All four of us. As scared as she was, and as sad as she was about her mom, she couldn't allow herself to think anything but positive thoughts. As long as we stick together, we'll be fine. Matt nodded. Tell me more about our inventory. Glad to talk about something tangible, Jessica said. With what you bought the other day, plus that 6-month supply of freeze-dried food we bought a few years ago, we're actually in great shape. That's fantastic. Both their gazes went to the computer monitor, which was still showing the news broadcast. It was 5 o'clock. Time for an update. Matt turned up the volume. A man they'd never seen on that news station sat in the anchor's chair, his expression stoic. He's new, Jessica said, as a sense of foreboding washed over her. Good evening, the man said. My name is Kevin Burns. I'm a producer, not a reporter, but today I am filling Amy Hunter's shoes, so to speak, because she is... The man's chin quivered slightly, but he held it together. Amy Hunter passed away this morning. Jessica shook her head. Another illness, another death. Kevin Burns stared into the camera. Last night, Amy came down with the bird flu, and, frowning, he looked at the surface of his desk before facing the camera again. That is how quickly this virus kills. He visibly swallowed. I have to be honest with you folks. Amy is not the first person at this news station to die from the bird flu. He paused. I fear she won't be the last. Kevin was silent for several seconds. We will continue broadcasting and bringing you the news as long as possible. We can get by on a skeleton crew if needed, but his jaw worked. We've lost a lot of our people, and many others are too scared to come in. A grim smile tugged up the corners of his mouth. I don't blame them. But like I said, we are here to keep you apprised of what is happening in our community and country and around the world, and we will do that for as long as we are able. Pounding on their front door startled Jessica. Matt raised his eyebrows, then stood and headed out of the office. Jessica followed close behind. Chapter 10. Matt. Hurrying through the family room, Matt held up a hand to Dylan and Kayla, who were standing near the front door with worried expressions. The blinds were down, covering the 2 long, narrow windows on either side of the front door, so Matt couldn't see who it was. I'll handle this. They nodded and stepped out of the way. Matt lifted a slat on the blinds, peeking out through one of the side lights. Who is it? Jessica whispered from beside him. He turned and frowned. Our neighbor, Jack Peters. Pounding sounded again, putting Matt on edge. What do you think he wants? Jessica asked, as Dylan and Kayla huddled around her. He shook his head. No idea. Matt pulled the blinds up, and Jack came into view. Jack's gaze shifted to Matt. Wild-eyed, Jack practically pressed his face against the glass. I need help! What's going on? Matt asked, as alarm flared inside him. Jack and his family lived 2 doors down. Matt didn't know him well, just well enough to chat with him if they both happened to be outside at the same time. Jack was Matt's age, late 30s, and married. He and his wife had 2 school-aged children. They're all sick, Jack said, as tears filled his eyes. "All of them!" Alarm turned to empathy. "Your family?" Jack nodded. "We need help." Matt had no idea what he could possibly do to help them. "Have you called your doctor?" The answer sounded lame even to him. Jack's family would most likely die. Calling the doctor would be a waste of energy. "Yes," Jack said, his face nearly crumpling. "The doctor's office just had a recording to call 911, but when I did, I got a busy signal." Panic swelled in Jack's eyes. "I called and called and called, but no one's answering." Fresh alarm swelled inside Matt, but he tamped it down. "I'm sorry, Jack." Jack's eyes widened. "Sorry? Sorry doesn't help." Baffled as to what to do, Matt shook his head. "There's nothing I can do." Jack turned away from the window and battered the door with both fists. "Open the damn door!" Kayla screamed. "Don't open it!" Jessica shouted. Turning to his family and holding up a hand, Matt gave them a look that said, "I've got this." Then he looked back at Jack, whose palms were now flattened against the glass. Speaking calmly yet firmly, Matt said, "You know I can't open the door, Jack. Now go home to your family and make them comfortable." An image of his own family, sick and dying, flashed through his head, and he almost lost his cool. But he couldn't think about that. He had to keep his composure. Had to keep Jack away from his front door. Jack began. Then he lowered his head as tears dripped down his face. His head lifted, and he looked at Matt, pleading in his eyes. "Do you have any Tylenol to ease their pain?" They had lots of Tylenol, and Matt was completely willing to give some to Jack, but he couldn't open the door. He couldn't chance exposing his family to the virus. "Tell you what," Matt said. "Come back in half an hour, and I'll leave some Tylenol on our porch." Relief flooded Jack's face. "Thank you." Glad he could do something that might help, but wouldn't endanger his family, Matt watched Jack turn around and make his way down the walkway to the sidewalk. When he was out of sight, Matt turned to face his family. They stared at him in silence. "That really freaked me out," Kayla finally said, her voice nearly shaking. "Me too," Dylan added. Matt's eyes sought out Jessica, who smiled softly at him before placing her hand on his arm. "You're a good man, Matt Bronson." Matt smiled at her. "Why did you tell him to wait half an hour?" Dylan asked. Looking at his son, Matt said, "Jack didn't look sick, but in case he is, I wanted to give the air by the door time to clear out." Dylan nodded. "Makes sense. Is that enough time?" Jessica asked. Matt had no idea. "You can't open the front door," Kayla said. "What if the virus is still in the air and it gets in the house?" "Wait," Dylan said. All eyes shifted to him. "What if you go out through the garage? Then you won't need to open the front door." "You're brilliant, son," Dylan beamed. "I'll get a bottle of Tylenol," Jessica said. Then she went into the kitchen. Moments later, she was back, holding a small baggie with some pills in it. "I don't think we should give away an entire bottle," she grimaced and held up the bag. "This should be enough to hold them for a while." Matt knew what she was saying. Jack's family would be dead within hours. They didn't need an entire bottle of pills. Leaning forward, Matt kissed Jessica on the lips. Then he took the baggie from her. He put on a face mask, then walked to the door that led to the garage. "I'll be back in a minute." He opened the door and went into the garage, then went to the man door that led to the backyard, opening it and stepping outside. The sun shone brightly, belying the turmoil that lay beneath its bright orb. Matt tilted his face toward the sun, soaking up its warmth. Then he turned to the gate that led to the front of the house, reaching for the latch. He hesitated. He hadn't been out front in days. What would he find? Drawing in a lungful of air, he braced himself. exhaled, then opened the gate and stepped through, the baggie of Tylenol in his hand and the mask covering his nose and mouth. Nothing. That's what he saw. Nothing and no one. All was silent, eerily silent. It was a spring afternoon. Children should have been outside playing, riding bikes. People should have been mowing their lawns, working in their yards. Instead, not a soul could be seen. Frowning, Matt strode across his driveway and toward the walkway that led to his front door. Movement caught his eye. It was Jack. He'd been hiding around the corner of Matt's house, but now he was barreling toward Matt, his eyes wild with fear. Sheer panic engulfed Matt. Flinging the baggie of pills in Jack's direction, Matt spun on his heel and bolted back in the direction he'd come. "Wait!" Jack screamed from 10 feet behind him, pure hysteria in his voice. "I need your help!" Ignoring Jack's plea, Matt propelled himself through the open gate, then slammed it closed behind him. A second later, Jack crashed into the vinyl gate, rattling it on its hinges. Not waiting to see if Jack would open the gate and come through, Matt burst through the man door, shutting it behind him with a bang before turning the deadbolt. Chest heaving and heart hammering against his ribs, Matt bent over, placing his hands on his knees. He didn't know how much his family had witnessed, but he didn't want them to see the terror in his eyes. So he took a moment to catch his breath and gather his emotions. Chapter 11. Jessica. Jessica admitted it. She'd been terrified to have Matt go outside and into their own front yard. What was the world coming to? A week ago, she wouldn't have thought twice about it. But now, everything had changed. Friends and family were dropping like flies, and she and Matt had to do all within their power to keep their family safe. She stood beside the sidelight, anxious to know what was happening. All of a sudden, Jack raced across the lawn in the direction Matt was coming from. Panic, stark and clear, shot through her, and she flew to the front window to see what was happening. The kids were right on her heels. "What's going on?" Kayla asked, her voice constricted with fear. The three of them stood at the front window, but they couldn't see a thing, not with the way the house was situated. Jack had run to their left, toward the garage side of the house. Jessica had heard him yelling that he needed help, but that was all she'd been able to see. "Dad needs us." "What should we do?" Dylan asked, his eyes wide. Jessica thought about the gun and ammo she'd seen Matt bring in on the day of his shopping spree. Matt had shown her where he was storing his weapons. Not taking the time to answer Dylan, Jessica ran to the closet in the master bedroom and quickly found a gun. Then she grabbed a loaded magazine before dashing to the garage. She pressed her ear against the door, but after hearing nothing, she opened the door, her gaze darting around the space until she saw Matt, bent forward with his hands on his knees. "Matt," she said. He straightened and spun around, his eyes wide as he took off his face mask. "Jess, what are you doing?" Seeing that he was alone and that the door leading to the backyard was locked, she took the 2 steps down into the garage, and with the gun pointed at the floor and the magazine in her other hand, she walked toward Matt. "Are you okay?" "Yeah. I saw Jack running." She stopped beside Matt and held out the gun for him to take. "I was worried, so I brought you this." He stared at the gun in her hand like it was a foreign object. Then he gazed at her before finally taking it and the magazine from her. Not sure what she expected him to do, she stood there watching him, waiting for some kind of guidance. When he didn't say anything, she asked, "What happened out there?" With a look of disbelief, he slowly shook his head. "Jack's gone stark raving mad." At that moment, pounding sounded on the man door. Jessica let out a scream, her heart in her throat. "Is that him?" Matt's gaze shot to the door, then he shoved the magazine into the gun. Yeah. He seemed rather calm, which helped to settle Jessica's nerves. Matt walked to the door and shouted, "Jack, calm down." "Open the door!" Jack yelled. "Open it right now!" Matt shook his head. "No can do, man. The Tylenol is out front. Grab it, then get off my property." "Or what?" Jack said, his voice shaky yet defiant. Matt racked the slide, the sound loud and clear. "Or I will shoot you." Jessica stared at Matt, her eyes wide with shock and fear. Would Matt really do that? But one look at his face, and she believed him wholeheartedly. There was silence on the other side of the door. "Do you think he left?" she whispered. Matt looked at her, his expression serious. "Don't know, but I'm not gonna open the door to find out." They stood there for at least 2 minutes before Matt lowered the gun. "Let's go inside," he said, tucking the gun into the back of his waistband. Jessica was more than happy to comply. She led the way, and the moment they stepped into the house, the kids began asking what had happened. Matt came into the house, locking the door behind him. Then, without answering the kids, he strode to the front room. Jessica and the kids followed him. When they caught up with him, Jessica looked over his shoulder as he peered out the window, and to her great relief, she saw Jack trudging down the sidewalk, away from their house. Exhaling audibly, Jessica felt her shoulders begin to relax. "He's gone," she said. "But will he come back?" Matt muttered. She didn't want to consider that, but she knew Matt was right. After all, Jack had hidden in the shadows, waiting for Matt to appear. Who knew what he was capable of? His family was dying. He had to be desperate. Matt stepped away from the window and turned to Jessica and the kids. "I'm going to board up the windows by the front door. Anything to keep them safe." "Good idea." "I want to help," Dylan said. "What happened out there?" Kayla asked. "I mean, we saw Jack running, Dad. Did he—" Her eyebrows tugged together. "Did he touch you?" Matt smiled and shook his head. "No, sweetie. I made it back into the garage before he caught up with me." This was surreal. Their neighbor had chased Matt down, and Matt had threatened to shoot him if he didn't leave. All because of a virus. A deadly virus. Blinking to clear her mind, Jessica forced a smile, but she felt like a fraud. She'd never been so worried and so terrified in her life. She liked to be in control, and right now, she wasn't. Not in any way, shape, or form. And she was pretty sure she wouldn't be for a long, long time. While Matt and Dylan went out to the garage to get scraps of wood, along with hammer and nails, Jessica thought about Jack's comment that no one was answering 911. Curious if he was exaggerating, she went into her bedroom and closed the door, then dialed 911. A moment later, a busy signal sounded, just as Jack had said. Frowning, Jessica tried again. Same result. Then she tried one more time. Busy. What was happening? Why was no one answering? Was help even available? Was everyone home with their families? Or were so many people sick or dead that there simply weren't enough people to help?